Okay, we're going to get started today on chapter 3. And what I'm going to do is the handouts that I've given you all, we're going to take a look at those. Okay, so I'm sorry you all didn't get the color codes, but you can always refer back to here. So I've got side-by-side income statements here, and they actually represent the same information. It's just that what we've seen before, we've got sales at the top. We've got our prime costs, which is the food, beverage, and labor. And then we have our overhead costs separately. And we come out to a profit of $144,000. And that's just from the total sales subtracting off those two amounts that are highlighted as our expenses. Okay, so on the right-hand side, you notice we still have the same profit of $144,000, but we renamed the costs and broke them down into variable costs and into fixed costs. So the food and the beverage costs are always variable costs. We separated out the labor costs into the two categories. The wages and benefits, which is the hourly folks that you have working in the restaurant, those are going to be variable costs. And then the rest of the salary, wages, and benefits, which is just salary and benefits, pointing at the screen here, comes down here. So originally we had $500,000 total labor cost. So we've got $300,000 going to wages, and then $200,000 going toward benefits. And then we're pulling up the total overhead cost here, because overhead cost is always fixed cost. And when we do the math, we come out with the exact same profit, $144,000. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so on the other side of the paper, this explains why we did that. We're going to start looking at our numbers in a way that can help us predict some things. So there's going to be two new things that we're going to learn how to calculate here. The variable rate, which is just going to be our variable cost. In this case, it's $750,000. And divide that by our sales, which is 1.46 million. And then we get this variable rate of 0.514. And we're always going to take that out to 3 decimal points. And we're not going to write it as a percentage. So we'll always be clear whenever we see this out to 3 decimal points, we're going to be talking about some type of a rate as opposed to a beverage cost percent or labor cost percent, that type of thing. Okay, so that's just taking the costs that change depending on how much business we have and comparing them to our sales. Now, I wish I had put these in another order, but if we just take a look at this, we're going to define something called the contribution rate. And it's going to cover the total of these two figures, our total fixed cost plus our restaurant profit. And those two numbers added together are called our contribution margin. And what that is saying is that that's going to be the amount of our expenses plus our profit. So at all times, this is going to be the easiest way to calculate this. Contribution rate is going to be equal to 1 minus the variable rate, because those two numbers have to add up to your total sales. If we look at fixed cost plus profit and we add variable costs, that is always going to be equal to our sales. Does that make sense? Because to calculate profit, we're just taking sales and subtracting variable costs and fixed costs. I'm not getting a lot of feedback. Anybody have questions or need to look at it a different way? Okay, we're going to do some examples with this. So, this formula is going to be a new formula for us that we're going to use a fair amount. The contribution rate is going to be, I'm going to show it here, the fixed cost plus the profit divided by total sales. Okay. So when we do that, we can calculate this both ways. We can either subtract the variable rate from 1 to get the contribution rate, or we can go ahead and do the actual division and calculation to get the contribution rate. Now, the way this is going to be helpful is if we rewrite this formula, we can, okay, yeah, I'm going to have to, the PowerPoint I'm going to go through and it's going to explain this. So we'll come back to this after we do the PowerPoint. But, okay, so this is going to be a new formula that comes out of chapter 3. We're going to be able to calculate the sales required in order to make a certain profit. So to do that, we're going to take our fixed costs and our desired profit and divide it by the contribution rate. Now, in order for this to be 100% true, we have to make some assumptions. But this will be used as a tool to predict how much business we need to have in order to make a certain profit. Okay, so fixed costs, we have defined that already as costs that remain steady over long periods of time. So they probably won't change over a period of 6 months to a year, at least not significantly. Profit in this formula is a goal that we would like to achieve. A lot of businesses need to know what is their break-even point, where you have generated enough sales to perfectly, exactly cover your expenses. So you set profit to 0 in that formula, and then you would just have sales required is equal to your fixed costs divided by the contribution rate. Okay. So these are the same sheets that you have in your handouts. They don't have all the lines and circles. So here are the assumptions that we're making. Okay. So fixed costs are going to be stable. That's part of our definition of fixed costs. Our sales prices are going to stay constant. So we're not going to be changing up our menu like every other week. And we're not going to increase prices or lower prices without having some meetings and approving doing that. We're going to assume that the sales mix will remain constant. If you remember sales mix from Tuesday, okay, so this is a sales mix. We have steak, chicken ribs, an entree salad, pork, duck, venison, and pasta. And over a period of time, we've established that this is a fairly constant sales mix. This is probably the weakest assumption because it's really very unlikely that these percentages are going to stay the same through any type of extended period. But we want to be able to get an idea of things like how many dollars in sales we need and how many people we need to come through the door. Yes?
So basically, during the sales required to be accurate, all of that has to be true.
Right, or we're assuming that this is true. And once we have several years of records, we can have a pretty good idea of how things might change over time. Okay, so this is the same sheet as what you got on your handout. And that's just a closer look at the variable rate and the contribution rate calculations. But those are the same numbers that are on the handout. So the other thing that we can do is calculate how many people need to come into the restaurant. Okay, so I have that G sub R is equal to your fixed cost divided by your contribution margin per guest. And then if you want to set up a dollar amount of profit, or I'm sorry, the number of guests to earn a specific dollar amount of profit. Let's say we wanted $100,000 in profit, we'd plug that into there and do the same thing to figure out how many guests we would need to come into the building. Okay, so how do we figure out contribution margin per guest? Suppose we had sales of $10,000 last week and we served 1,000 guests. That means our average check was $10. Okay, we just take the $10,000 divided by 1,000 guests. On our income statement, we calculated that the variable rate was 0.514, and that means that our average food cost was $5.14 per guest. So we take the sales price, subtract the variable cost, or the average food cost, and then we have $4.86. And that is our contribution margin per guest on average. And most of the time, the hardest thing you're going to have to do is divide your variable cost by sales and then subtract that from 1 to get your contribution rate. So for an example, our fixed cost, I think this is the case on the handout, $566,000. Okay, we want to calculate the break-even point. The average contribution margin per guest is $4.86. So the number of guests required to make that profit, you divide the 556,000 by $4.86, and that indicates 116,460, and we're going to round that up to 1 because we can't have part of a person come in. So at this point, that's our annual goal, is to have that to break even for a year. So if we need to get 116,000 guests in a year, we can break that down, divide it by 12, and figure out how many people we need in a month. If we do that, it looks like it's a little bit under 10,000 a month. If it were 10,000 each month, it would be 120,000. And our goal is 116. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we needed 10,000 people a month, we're open 30 days a month. How many people do we need in a day to come in? I'm asking because I'm not doing it in my head just now. So we need 333, 334 persons on average per day to be able to break even with these numbers. Okay, so then we have to figure out, can we do that? Is our dining room big enough to do that? Do we live in a place where we can get 300 people coming through each day and ordering an average of $10 from us? So do you think that's possible? Do you think if you have something like a fast food restaurant like McDonald's or Popeye's Chicken, you get 300 checks a day? Probably that kind of a restaurant, and that's close to the check average that we're looking at, is roughly $10 if somebody's going in there. but that's just to break even. If we wanted to set a certain profit, look, did it try this already? This came up by the week. Shoot. So if we were going to do for a profit, let me get open up an Excel. So we had fixed costs of 566,000. And how much profit do we want to make on our, let's see, $1.4 million? Let's just pick 200,000. That sound fair? Okay, so I'm going to add these two together. So that comes to $766,000. That's our fixed costs plus the profits. And then our contribution rate is $4.86. If we divide that into this, it's 157,613, but that's not a dollar. This is the number of people. So I would still answer then 157,614. And then if I divide that by 12, oops, it doesn't come out that way. That would be 13,000 people a month. And then if I divide it by 30, what am I doing? That takes us up to 438 people today, or per day, in order to get that $200,000 of profit. So that might be a little trickier. Here in Thibodeau, do you think we've got a fast food restaurant doing that? Yeah, well, I don't see that I'm watching. Some larger cities are going to be able to definitely do that. If you've ever been into New York City, just like those places don't ever stop. There's always a line. And of course, they charge a lot more there than they do here, but their expenses are higher than what we have here. Okay, so close this. Oh, I should have. We have a handout for an exercise in the class. Okay, so this is our budget. We have the figures for the end of the year to 2020, and then we have a predicted amount of change during 2021. And our first question is going to be to calculate the expected profit for 2021. So we're going to be looking at this column here. And then well, I want to do food cost percent for 2020 and for 2021, food cost percent, beverage cost percent, labor cost percent. So I want you to do that. I'm going to do my calculations so that you can't see them. Okay, so has anybody calculated profit? Nobody has profit yet? Say that louder. 149,000? Yes, 149,000. So that's the 1.66 million minus the 1,050,000 minus the 461,000. Okay. We've got sales up here. That's our total sales. So for 2021, okay, so for 2021, our expected sales is 1.66 million. Okay, and then these are our costs. So we've got the prime costs and the overhead costs. When you cover them both in Excel, it comes up with the total down at the bottom, 1.511 million. So you can just take the 16 and subtract the 1 and the 461,000, and that gives you your 149. So if this formula up here is telling you take your sales, subtract your prime costs, subtract your overhead costs, and then you have your profit. Does that make sense? You came up with a negative number? Okay. You might have just typed something in incorrectly. What number did you get? Okay. Alrighty, so what about 2020, the food cost percent? 37? 36.4? I'm getting 36.4. Let me, okay, so if you get an answer that looks like this, 36.3636, you're rounding that up to the 1 decimal point. So if that second decimal point is 5 or higher, you're going to round it up. If it's a 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0, then it goes, it would stay at the 3. Okay, beverage cost percent. Something 0.1? 21.1, okay. And labor cost? 31.7. Oops. 31.7. Okay. And then, let's see, I think I have more. for 2021. Oops. I've got food cost percent actually going up to 36.6. Beverage cost percent down slightly to 21%. I'm trying to figure out why that cursor is moving. And then labor cost is going down to 31.3%. Okay, any questions on this? So this is kind of a variation of what's on the Excel quiz. Which again, but the Excel quiz is due on Thursday, September 2nd. Basically, you should have enough information now to do the module quiz and the Excel quiz. So next Tuesday is the 31st. We'll do a review of the first 3 chapters, and then the quizzes are going to be due next Thursday night. All right. Questions? All righty. I'll have plenty of things for you to practice on Tuesday.